The summer of 1951 hit Harlem with a wet, heavy heat that seemed to rise up from the subway grates and settle over the avenues like a wool blanket. It was the kind of weather that made the asphalt soft enough to hold the impression of a shoe, the kind that shortened tempers and made the nights restless. But for Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the heat was the least of his worries. The king of Harlem was sweating, but it wasn't because of the temperature. It was because for the first time in years, he could feel the crosshairs on the back of his neck, and he didn't know who was holding the rifle. The trouble had started 2 weeks ago, on a Tuesday that should have been routine. Bumpy had a meeting scheduled with a union delegate from the Brooklyn shipping yards. It was sensitive business, the kind that wasn't written in any appointment book, involving the distribution of certain goods that were coming in off the docks. The location was a small, family-owned Italian restaurant on the Lower East Side called Lombardi's. It was neutral ground, far away from the prying eyes of Harlem, a place where Bumpy could speak freely without his own men overhearing. Only 3 people in the world knew the time and location of that meeting: his wife Mamie, his most trusted lieutenant Junie Bird, and the driver who took him there. Bumpy was a man who prided himself on punctuality. In his business, being late was an insult, and being early was a sign of anxiety. He aimed to walk through the door exactly as the second hand swept past the 12. But that Tuesday, fate had intervened in the form of a stalled delivery truck on 2nd Avenue. The resulting traffic jam had cost him 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes of idling in the humid air, watching the steam rise from the radiator of the taxi in front of him. As his sleek black Cadillac Fleetwood finally pulled up to the curb in front of Lombardi's, Bumpy was checking his watch, frowning at the delay. He reached for the door handle, preparing his apology for the delegate. He never got the chance to make it. Before his driver could even put the car in park, the storefront of Lombardi's erupted. It wasn't a fire. It was a concussion. A shockwave of orange fire and black smoke blew the plate glass windows out into the street with a deafening roar. The force of the blast shook the heavy Cadillac, rattling Bumpy's teeth in his head and cracking the windshield. He watched in stunned silence as the sign above the door swung wildly on one hinge and then crashed to the pavement, shattering into 1,000 pieces amidst a rain of brick and mortar. If the truck hadn't stalled, if he had been on time, he would have been walking through that door exactly when the bomb went off. He would have been nothing more than a memory, a story told in the barber shops of 125th Street. Bumpy ordered the driver to go, peeling away from the scene before the dust had even settled or the sirens began to wail. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a cold knot of dread forming in his stomach. That bomb wasn't a warning. Warnings are bricks through windows or dead fish on doorsteps. That bomb was an assassination, and it was timed perfectly. Whoever planted it knew exactly when Bumpy Johnson was supposed to walk through that door. 3 days later, they tried again. Bumpy was leaving his apartment building at 409 Edgecombe Avenue. He had spent the last 72 hours in a state of high alert, doubling his guard, changing his routines. He never left the house at the same time, and he never took the same route twice. On this particular morning, he decided to leave through the side entrance that led into the alley, a heavy steel door he hadn't used in months. He stepped out into the morning light, adjusting the brim of his fedora. The alley was quiet, shadowed by the high brick walls of the neighboring buildings. The smell of garbage and damp brick filled the air. He took 2 steps toward the waiting car when a flash of light caught his eye. It was high up on the roof of the tenement building across the street, a glint of sun on metal. Instinct, honed by years in the damp cells of Sing Sing and the yard at Auburn, took over. Bumpy didn't think. He dropped. He threw himself to the dirty pavement just as the air above his head snapped with the sharp crack of a high-powered rifle. The bullet chipped the stone doorframe exactly where his head had been a fraction of a second before. sending stone splinters raining down on his hat. Bumpy scrambled back inside on his hands and knees, shouting for his men. They rushed into the alley with guns drawn, weapons raised toward the rooftops. But the shooter was already gone. All they found on the roof later was a cigarette butt, still warm, and a clear line of sight to the side door. Bumpy sat in his hallway, leaning against the heavy oak door, breathing hard. He wasn't shaking from fear. He was shaking from rage. The Jewish Syndicate. It had to be them, the Bronx crew. The style of the hits, the precision bomb, the rooftop sniper, spoke of their discipline and resources. They were the only ones currently disputing the expansion of the numbers racket into the Bronx. But the Jewish syndicates didn't have magic crystal balls. They couldn't know he was meeting a union rep at a random Italian restaurant on a Tuesday. They couldn't know he would use the side door of his apartment building on a Thursday morning. They knew because someone told them. The realization settled over Bumpy like a shroud. There was a rat, a traitor, someone in his inner circle, someone he broke bread with, someone he trusted with his life, was selling him out. And they were doing it with terrifying accuracy. That evening, the atmosphere in the apartment on Sugar Hill was suffocating. Heavy electric fans whirred in the corners, battling the heat, but they couldn't touch the chill in the room. Bumpy stood by the window, peering through the blinds at the street below. He felt like a prisoner in his own kingdom, unable to step outside without wondering if the man lighting his cigar was also lighting the fuse on his coffin. Junie Bird sat on the velvet sofa, cleaning his fingernails with a small pocket knife. Junie was a small man, wiry and unassuming, with a face that was easy to forget. But that was his power. Junie Bird was the most dangerous man in Harlem because he was invisible. He saw everything, heard everything, and forgot nothing. He was the only man Bumpy trusted completely, the only one whose loyalty wasn't for sale. "They are getting closer, boss," Junie said softly, not looking up from his nails. "That shot this morning? That was professional work. The old Murder Inc. crew used to hire shooters like that. It cost a fortune." "I know it was professional," Bumpy snapped, turning away from the window. He poured himself a glass of water, his large hand gripping the crystal tumbler tight enough to crack it. "The question isn't who is pulling the trigger. The question is who is pointing the finger." "You think we have a leak?" Junie asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I don't think, Junie. I know." Bumpy paced the length of the room, his shadow stretching long across the floor. The restaurant, the side door, the collection run last week that got hit before the money was even in the bag. Someone is feeding them my schedule. Someone close. Junie stopped cleaning his nails. He looked up, his dark eyes narrowing. "Who?" "That is the problem," Bumpy said, stopping in front of the fireplace. "It could be anyone." "Whispers? He's been with me since the beginning, but he's got gambling debts." "Roland? He's ambitious, always talking about how we need to modernize, how we need to expand." "Big Sam? He's loyal, but he's simple. Maybe someone tricked him." "We can shake the tree," Junie suggested, his voice devoid of emotion. "We can bring them into the basement, one by one. A little pressure usually makes the truth come out." "No," Bumpy shook his head. "If we start questioning people, the rat goes underground. He gets scared. He stops talking to the Jews, and we never find him. Or worse, he panics and makes a desperate move. If he feels cornered, he might try to hit Mamie to get to me." Bumpy looked toward the closed bedroom door where Mamie was resting. The thought of his wife being caught in the crossfire turned his blood to ice. He had built this life to give her everything, to make her a queen. If his life brought violence to her doorstep, he would never forgive himself. He couldn't let that happen. He needed to end this. and he needed to end it now. "I need a way to make the rat show his face," Bumpy murmured, staring at the painting on the wall. "I need him to feel safe. I need him to think he won." "He won't think he won until you are in the ground," Junie said grimly. Bumpy froze. He turned slowly to look at Junie. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and pregnant with possibility. "Say that again," Bumpy whispered. "I said, he won't think he won until you are in the ground. As long as you are breathing, the rat is going to be looking over his shoulder." Bumpy leaned back against the mantelpiece, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a chess player who just saw checkmate 5 moves ahead. "Then let's put me in the ground," Bumpy said. The plan was insane. It was reckless. It was the kind of theatrical gambit that belonged in a movie, not on the streets of Harlem. But Bumpy Johnson was a man who lived on the edge of the razor, and right now, he had no other options. He spent the next hour outlining the details to Junie. It had to be a total blackout. No one could know except the 2 of them and Mamie. If they did a big public funeral, the whole city would turn out, and there would be too many eyes, too many variables. It had to be intimate, a small, private ceremony. Just the lieutenants, just the inner circle, the people who had access to his schedule. But first, the hardest part. He had to tell Mamie. He walked into the bedroom. Mamie was sitting up in bed reading a book, the lamp casting a warm golden glow over her features. She looked up as he entered, and she saw the look on his face immediately. She knew that look. It was the look that meant trouble. It was the look that meant he was about to ask for the impossible. "What is it?" she asked, closing her book and setting it on the nightstand. "Is it the police?" "No," Bumpy said. He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress shifting under his weight. He took her hands in his. Her skin was soft, warm, alive. "Mamie, I have to ask you to do something, and it is going to be the hardest thing I have ever asked you to do." She squeezed his hand, her eyes searching his face. "Is it dangerous?" "Not for you, but it is going to hurt. I need you to act, Mamie. I need you to give the performance of your life." He told her the plan. He spoke quietly, outlining the fake heart attack, the hidden funeral home, the open casket. As he spoke, he watched her face go pale. She pulled her hands away, shaking her head violently. "No," she whispered. "Bumpy, no. You can't ask me to do that. You want me to pretend you are dead? You want me to mourn you while you are still breathing? That is bad luck, Bumpy. That is tempting fate. You don't play with death like that." "It is the only way," he pleaded, grabbing her hands again. "They are going to kill me, Mamie. If I don't stop them, they will get lucky, eventually. Today it was inches. Tomorrow it might be feet. I have to flush him out. I have to know who is betraying us. If I don't, we will never be safe. You will never be safe." "But what if something goes wrong?" she asked, tears welling in her eyes. "What if you take the pills and you don't wake up? What if the police demand an autopsy?" "Nothing will go wrong," he promised. "Junie has it handled. We have the doctor on payroll. We have the funeral director. But I need you to sell it. The men, they watch you. If they see you aren't broken, they will get suspicious. You have to be the grieving widow. You have to convince them that the king is dead." Mamie looked at him for a long time. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the fear that he tried so hard to hide from the world. She knew he was right. They were living in a house of cards, and someone was shaking the table. "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I will do it. But you promise me, Ellsworth Johnson, you promise me that you will come back to me. You don't leave me alone in that church." "I promise," he said, kissing her forehead. "I'm not going anywhere." The next day, the news hit the streets of Harlem like a thunderclap. Bumpy Johnson was dead. The official story was a massive heart attack. It happened at Wells' Supper Club, right over a plate of chicken and waffles. He had been dining with Junie and Mamie when he suddenly clutched his chest, turned a shade of gray that terrified the waitstaff, and collapsed onto the table. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. It was a lie, of course, a carefully orchestrated piece of theater. Bumpy had taken a mild Haitian tetrodotoxin mixture that Junie had procured, enough to slow his heart rate to a crawl and drop his body temperature, fooling a cursory check. The ambulance was driven by Junie's cousin from Queens, and the paramedics were Bumpy's own men in uniform. They took him not to the hospital, but to the back door of a private funeral home on 116th Street, owned by a man who owed Bumpy more favors than he could count. Bumpy lay in the preparation room of the funeral home, staring up at the water-stained ceiling tiles. It was strange to be dead. The world continued on without him. He could hear the muffled sounds of the street outside, the horns honking, the people shouting. The air smelled of formaldehyde and lilies, a cloying, sweet scent that made his stomach turn. Junie came in an hour later. He looked grim, dressed in a black suit. "It's done, boss. The word is out. The Jewish crews are celebrating. I heard they're popping champagne in Brooklyn. They think they finally got you with stress." "Let them celebrate," Bumpy said, his voice raspy from the drug. It made his tongue feel thick. "What about my men?" "They are in shock. Whispers looks like he lost his father. He was crying in the lobby. Big Sam is punching walls. But what?" "There is a lot of talk about who takes over," Junie said quietly. "The body isn't even cold, and the vultures are circling." "Who?" Bumpy asked, sitting up slowly. The drug made him dizzy. "Roland," Junie said. Bumpy's eyes narrowed. Roland. It made sense. Roland was one of his top lieutenants, young, flashy, ambitious. He liked the suits, the cars, the attention. Bumpy had always kept him on a short leash, and Roland had always resented it. Roland felt he was the future, and Bumpy was the past. "What is he doing?" Bumpy asked. "He is telling everyone that he was your pick," Junie said, disgust coloring his tone. "He says you told him last week that if anything happened, he was to take the chair. He's already giving orders, Bumpy. He's already moving people around." Bumpy's jaw clenched. "Did I tell him that?" he asked sarcastically. "I don't recall that conversation, boss," Junie smirked. "Is he the rat?" "He fits the profile. He spends a lot of money, more than he earns, and he has been seen downtown a lot lately. But we need proof. We need him to show his hand. We need him to admit it." "He will show it tomorrow," Bumpy said, lying back down on the metal table. At the funeral. The preparations for the funeral were swift and quiet. Mamie played her part to perfection. She refused to see anyone. She stayed in the apartment, wailing loud enough for the neighbors to hear, creating a wall of grief that no one dared to breach. She was the heartbroken widow, inconsolable, unreachable. The funeral was set for the following evening at a small private chapel attached to the funeral home. Bumpy had left strict instructions in his will, a document Junie had forged that morning, that he wanted an open casket, but a closed service. Only the top lieutenants. No press, no public, no spectacle. The night of the funeral arrived. The air in the chapel was heavy, suffocating. It was a small room, dimly lit by flickering candles that cast long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. The casket stood at the front, a magnificent box of polished mahogany and brass, lined with white silk. Bumpy lay inside, He was dressed in his best suit, a dark blue silk that shimmered in the candlelight. His hands were folded over his chest, holding a rosary. His face was made up to look pale, waxy. The paralysis drug had worn off hours ago, but he had practiced his breathing for hours, taking shallow, imperceptible sips of air, keeping his chest still. It was a meditative state, a suspension of life. He could hear them coming in, the heavy footsteps of men trying to walk softly on stone floors, the hushed whispers, the sniffles. He recognized the voices. There was Whispers, crying softly, blowing his nose. Big Sam muttering prayers in a low rumble. And there was Roland. Roland wasn't crying. Roland was talking. He looks peaceful, doesn't he? Roland's voice was too loud, too confident. It lacked the tremor of grief. It sounded like a man inspecting a piece of furniture he had just bought. "Shut up, Roland," Whispers hissed. "Have some respect. The man is dead." "I have respect," Roland countered, his voice smooth. "But life goes on, Whispers. Bumpy would want us to be strong. He would want us to secure the business. We can't let the Jews see us weak." "I'm just saying, someone needs to step up." Bumpy lay there, his heart rate slow and steady, listening to the man who wanted his crown. He felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp, but he pushed it down. He forced his body to remain a corpse. Not yet. The service was short. The preacher, a man on Junie's payroll who knew better than to ask questions, read a few psalms about valleys and shadows. Mamie sat in the front row, veiled in black lace. Bumpy could hear her weeping. It sounded real. It broke his heart to hear it, even knowing it was an act. She was calling his name, begging him to come back. It was a performance that would have won awards on Broadway. Then it was time for the viewing. One by one, the men approached the casket to say their final goodbyes. Bumpy felt their presence, their heat. Whispers leaned in and kissed his forehead. His tears were wet on Bumpy's skin. "Goodbye, boss," Whispers choked out. "You were the best of us. I'll watch over Mamie. I promise." Bumpy wanted to reach up and pat the big man's hand, to tell him it was okay. But he remained motionless. Big Sam came next, placing a heavy hand on the edge of the casket. "Rest easy, King." Then Junie. Junie leaned close, pretending to fix Bumpy's tie. "We are almost there," Junie whispered, his lips barely moving. "Everyone is leaving. I told them Mamie needs a moment alone in the vestry. But Roland is hanging back. He says he wants to say a final private goodbye." Bumpy didn't move, but his mind sharpened. The trap was sprung. The rat had taken the cheese. The footsteps receded. The heavy oak doors of the chapel creaked open and then thumped shut. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the sputtering of the candles and the distant sound of traffic. But the room wasn't empty. Bumpy listened. He heard the scrape of a shoe on the stone floor. Slow, deliberate, confident. He waited. He needed the man to be close. He needed to be sure. The footsteps approached the casket. They didn't sound like the footsteps of a mourner. They sounded like the footsteps of a conqueror. Roland stopped right next to the casket. Bumpy could hear his breathing. It was fast, excited. Roland laughed. It was a low, ugly sound, a chuckle of pure triumph. "They called you a king," Roland whispered. He leaned over the casket. Bumpy could feel the man's breath on his face. It smelled of expensive scotch and cheap tobacco. "You weren't a king, old man. You were just a roadblock. You were in the way of progress. And now the road is clear." Bumpy lay still. He waited for the confession. He waited for the proof. "You know," Roland continued, his voice dripping with malice, "the Jews paid good money for your schedule. A lot of money. But honestly, I would have done it for free. I hated the way you looked at me. Like I was a child. Like I was nothing. You thought you were untouchable. But you bleed just like the rest of us." There it was. The truth. Roland had sold him out. Roland had planted the bomb. Roland had called the sniper. The man Bumpy had taken off the street, the man he had dressed and fed, had sold his life for a bag of silver. "Well, look at you now," Roland sneered. "You aren't looking at me like I'm nothing anymore. You aren't looking at anything." Then Bumpy heard a sound that made his blood boil. A sharp intake of breath, followed by a wet, guttural noise in the back of Roland's throat. Roland gathered the saliva in his mouth. He leaned directly over Bumpy's face. "This is for all the times you told me no," Roland hissed. The spit hit Bumpy's cheek. It was warm and vile. It trickled down toward his ear. It was the ultimate disrespect. In the world they lived in, this was worse than a bullet. A bullet was business. This was a violation of the soul. It was a desecration. Roland straightened up, chuckling to himself. He turned to walk away, confident that he was the new king of Harlem, confident that the dead man in the box was gone forever. But the dead man wasn't gone. Bumpy opened his eyes. The movement was subtle at first, just the eyelids snapping open, revealing eyes that were dark, clear, and burning with a hellfire of rage. Bumpy inhaled. It was a deep, jagged breath, filling lungs that had been shallow for hours. The sound was like wind rushing through a cavern. Roland froze. He hadn't seen it, but he had heard it. The sound of a corpse taking a breath. Roland stopped mid-stride. He turned around slowly, his face draining of color, his smile faltering. Bumpy sat up. It wasn't a fast movement. His muscles were stiff from lying still, making the motion look mechanical, like the rise of a nightmare. He gripped the silk lining of the coffin with one hand and pulled himself upright. The candlelight caught the angles of his face, making him look like a demon rising from the pit. The makeup made him look pale, dead, but the eyes were terrifyingly alive. Roland's mouth fell open. His eyes bulged. He tried to speak, but only a strangled squeak came out. His brain couldn't process what he was seeing. Bumpy Johnson was dead. He had seen the body. He had seen the grief. Bumpy reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his silk handkerchief. He calmly, deliberately, wiped the spit from his cheek. He looked at the handkerchief, folded it neatly, and placed it back in his pocket. Then he looked at Roland. "You missed a spot," Bumpy said. His voice was gravel and tomb dirt. Roland screamed. It was a sound torn from the very bottom of his lungs, a raw, jagged shriek of primal terror that shattered the solemn silence of the chapel. It wasn't the scream of a gangster or a tough guy. It was the scream of a man whose reality had just snapped in half. He stumbled backward, his expensive Italian shoes slipping on the stone floor, his arms flailing as he tried to put distance between himself and the mahogany casket. "No!" Roland shrieked, his voice cracking into a high pitch as he backed into a pew. He tripped over his own feet and fell hard onto his back, scrambling crab-like across the cold floor, his eyes locked on the figure rising from the silk lining. God, oh God. Bumpy Johnson stood up. He didn't rush. He didn't leap. He rose with the terrifying, inevitable grace of a statue coming to life. He gripped the edges of the casket with hands that looked like iron, pulling himself up until he was standing on the dais. The candlelight flickered across his face, catching the pale makeup and the dark, burning intensity of his eyes. He looked like Judgment Day in a blue silk suit. Bumpy stepped out of the casket. He shook out his legs, forcing the blood to flow, adjusting his jacket. He reached up and straightened his tie, a mundane, human action that made the moment even more terrifying. He stepped down from the platform and walked toward the cowering traitor. "I'm not a ghost, Roland," Bumpy said, his voice deep and vibrating with authority. "I'm something much worse. I'm your boss." The heavy oak doors of the chapel burst open with a crash that shook the walls. Junie Bird rushed in first, his face set in the mask of grim determination. Behind him came Whispers, Big Sam, and two of Bumpy's most loyal enforcers. They had been waiting in the vestry, counting the seconds, waiting for Bumpy's signal. But the scream had been signal enough. They stopped dead in their tracks, their weapons raised. The scene before them was something out of a nightmare. They saw Roland on the floor, weeping and hyperventilating, trying to crawl under a wooden pew like a frightened dog. And standing over him, tall and terrible, was Bumpy Johnson. The man they had just mourned. The man they had just seen lying cold and still. "Boss?" Whispers gasped, the barrel of his shotgun lowering as his jaw dropped. You're alive?" Bumpy didn't look at his men. He didn't acknowledge their shock. He kept his eyes locked on Roland, pinning the traitor to the floor with his gaze. Roland saw the men enter. His mind, already fractured by fear, finally snapped. He was cornered. He was facing a dead man walking and a room full of killers. Panic overrode logic. Panic overrode loyalty. He looked at the men who used to be his brothers, and he saw his death written in their eyes. He reached into his jacket. "He has a gun!" Junie shouted, raising his pistol. Roland pulled a snub-nosed .38 caliber revolver from his shoulder holster. He scrambled to his knees, pointing the weapon with shaking hands. He didn't know who to shoot. The ghost? The men at the door? He swung the barrel wildly, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Drop it, Roland!" Big Sam roared, stepping forward and raising his own massive handgun. Instinct took over the room. The shock of seeing Bumpy alive vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by the muscle memory of protection. Every man in the room, Whispers, Junie, Big Sam, the enforcers, drew their weapons. 5 guns were leveled instantly at Roland's chest. The air in the chapel grew instantly electric, charged with the promise of violence. "Drop the weapon!" Whispers screamed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Do it now, or I will cut you in half." Roland looked at them. He looked at the wall of steel facing him. Then he looked at Bumpy. He saw the cold certainty of death in the king's eyes. He knew there was no way out. If he dropped the gun, Bumpy would kill him for the betrayal. If he didn't drop it, the boys would cut him down in a hail of bullets. He looked at Bumpy. Bumpy was just standing there, 5 feet away. He wasn't armed. He didn't have a gun in his hand. He was just watching, a look of utter, crushing disappointment on his face. "You set me up," Roland sobbed, the tears mixing with the sweat and snot on his face. "You tricked me. You were never dead. You played me." "You tricked yourself," Bumpy said calmly, taking a slow step forward. "You spat on me, Roland. You spat on a man who treated you like a son. You spat on the hand that fed you." Roland's face twisted into a snarl of hate and fear. He was trapped. He was dead. And if he was going to die, he was going to take the devil with him. He was going to finish the job the Jews couldn't. "Go back to hell!" Roland screamed. He aimed the pistol directly at Bumpy's chest. The distance was point blank. He couldn't miss. "No!" The scream came from the doorway. It was Mamie. She had run in behind the men, her face pale with terror. She saw the gun pointed at her husband's heart. Roland squeezed the trigger. His knuckles turned white. He closed his eyes, expecting the recoil, expecting the deafening explosion, expecting the satisfaction of seeing the king fall one last time. The hammer fell. Click. The sound was tiny, insignificant, mechanical. But in the silence of the chapel, it sounded like a thunderclap. Roland's eyes snapped open. He stared at the gun in his hand. He couldn't believe it. He squeezed the trigger again, harder this time. Click. Click. Nothing happened. No explosion. No bullet. Just the dry, metallic sound of failure. Roland looked up, confusion warring with terror in his eyes. He shook the gun, staring down the barrel as if he could will the bullets to appear by magic. Bumpy didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just shook his head slowly, a look of pity crossing his face. "You really think," Bumpy said softly, stepping closer until the barrel of the useless gun was touching his chest, "that I would let a man like you walk into my funeral with a loaded gun?" Bumpy looked at Junie Bird. Junie stepped forward, a small, grim smile on his face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of bullets. He opened his hand and dropped them on the floor. They pinged and rolled across the stone, glittering like fool's gold in the candlelight. "I saw you leave your jacket in the vestry earlier, Roland," Junie said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You were sweating so hard you took it off for 5 minutes to cool down. You didn't even notice me slip in there while you were pacing the hall. It was very easy to strip the magazine and clear the chamber." Roland looked at the bullets on the floor. The reality of his situation crashed down on him like a collapsing building. The gun fell from his numb fingers, clattering uselessly on the stone. He collapsed forward, putting his head on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. "It's over," Bumpy said. He looked at his men. They were still staring at him, stunned, confused, but their guns were still trained on the traitor. Bumpy took a deep breath. He looked at Whispers. "I'm sorry, Whispers. I had to do it. I had to know." Whispers looked at Bumpy, then at Roland, then back at Bumpy. A slow grin spread across his face. Tears were still drying on his cheeks, but the joy in his eyes was blinding. "You crazy son of a," Whispers laughed, a shaken, relieved sound. "You scared the life out of me, boss. I thought we lost you. I thought Harlem was finished." "I'm sorry," Bumpy repeated. He looked at the group, his expression softening. "I couldn't tell you. The circle had to be tight. If Roland knew I was alive, he would have never shown his face. He would have kept hiding in the shadows, taking shots at me, taking shots at Mamie. I had to become the bait to catch the rat." Big Sam holstered his gun. He walked over and poked Bumpy in the chest with a massive finger. "Solid. You are solid. You ain't a ghost." "I'm solid, Sam," Bumpy promised. He turned back to Roland. The traitor was curled into a ball, shaking, muttering to himself. A broken man. "Get him up," Bumpy ordered. Big Sam and Whispers moved instantly. They grabbed Roland by the arms and hauled him to his feet. Roland's legs were like jelly. He couldn't stand. They had to hold him up, his expensive shoes dragging on the stone. Bumpy walked up to him. He stood nose to nose with the man who had tried to kill him. He could smell the fear on him, a sour, acrid scent. "Why?" Bumpy asked. Just one word. Why? Roland looked up. His eyes were red, hollow, empty. "Money," he whispered. "They offered me so much money. And I wanted the chair. I wanted to be the king. I was tired of waiting, Bumpy. I was tired of being the prince. I was tired of asking for permission." Bumpy nodded slowly. He understood ambition. He understood greed. But he didn't understand treason. "You wanted the chair," Bumpy said. He looked at the open casket behind him. The satin pillow was still dented where his head had lain. The box that was meant to be his final resting place. You wanted my spot, Roland. You wanted it so bad, you were willing to kill for it. You were willing to spit on my memory for it. You wanted to bury me so you could rise. Bumpy turned to Whispers. His face was a mask of stone. Give him what he wants. Whispers frowned. Boss? Put him in the box, Bumpy said, cold as ice. The command hung in the air of the chapel, heavier than the scent of the lilies, colder than the stone floor beneath their feet. Put him in the box. Roland's eyes bulged. He looked at the mahogany casket, then back at Bumpy. The realization of what was happening hit him with the force of a physical blow. No, Roland whispered, his voice cracking. No, boss, please. Just shoot me. Put a bullet in my head. Don't put me in there. Not the box. Bumpy didn't answer. He just adjusted his cuffs, brushing off an invisible speck of dust, the picture of calm authority amidst the chaos. You heard the man, Big Sam growled. Sam and Whispers tightened their grip on Roland's arms. Roland began to struggle, his legs kicking out wildly, his heels screeching against the floor. He was a desperate animal now, fighting not for his life, but for the manner of his death. I'm sorry, Roland screamed, thrashing as they dragged him toward the dais. Junie, help me! Mamie! Mrs. Johnson! Don't let them do this! Mamie stood by the door, her face pale, but her eyes dry. She looked at the man who had planted a bomb to kill her husband. She looked at the man who had spat on his face. She felt no pity. She turned her head away. They reached the casket. Roland hooked his legs around the brass stand, screaming, sobbing, snot running down his face. Please, I'm claustrophobic. I can't be in the dark. Bumpy, please. You should have thought about that before you sold me to the Jews, Bumpy said, walking over to the casket. He looked down into the silk-lined interior. It's comfortable, Roland. I was just in there. Plenty of room for a man of your stature. No, no, no! Big Sam, a man who could lift a car engine block without breaking a sweat, broke Roland's grip on the stand with a single, sharp tug. He lifted Roland into the air as easily as if he were a child. Roland flailed, grabbing at the edges of the casket, his fingernails digging into the wood. Whispers grabbed his legs. Together, they forced him down. Roland curled up, trying to spring back out, but Big Sam placed a massive hand on his chest and shoved him down into the satin. Stay, Sam barked. Bumpy, Roland shrieked, staring up at the ceiling of the chapel. I'll tell you everything. I'll tell you names. I'll tell you where their safe house is. Don't close it. Don't close the lid. Bumpy held up a hand. Sam and Whispers paused, holding Roland down. Bumpy leaned over the casket. He looked down at the traitor. Roland was hyperventilating, his chest heaving, sweat soaking his shirt. You'll tell me names? Bumpy asked softly. Yes, yes, Roland gasped, hope flooding his eyes. The Jewish crew, the ones who paid me. Their contact is a guy named Goldberg. He runs a deli on 4th Street. They meet in the basement. I can take you there. I can give them to you. Bumpy nodded slowly. Goldberg. On 4th. Yes, I swear. Just let me up. I'll work for you for free. I'll be your dog, Bumpy. Just don't bury me. Bumpy looked at Junie Bird. Write that down, Junie. Goldberg, 4th Street. Junie pulled out a small notepad and scribbled it down. Got it, boss. Bumpy turned back to Roland. He smiled. It was a sad, tired smile. Thank you, Roland. You finally did something useful. Roland let out a sob of relief. Thank you, boss, thank you. I won't let you down. I swear. I know you won't, Bumpy said. Bumpy reached out and grabbed the heavy mahogany lid of the casket. Roland's eyes widened. Wait. You said... I didn't say anything, Bumpy said. I just listened." "No!" Roland screamed, realizing the trick. He surged upward, but Big Sam shoved him back down with a grunt. "You wanted to be the king," Bumpy said, his voice hard as iron. "The king is dead, Roland. Long live the king." Bumpy slammed the lid shut. The sound was final, a heavy, dull thud that echoed through the church. The screaming from inside was muffled instantly, turning into a dull, frantic thumping. The heavy wood absorbed the sound, reducing the traitor's terror to a distant vibration. "Lock it," Bumpy ordered. Whispers engaged the brass latches on the side of the casket. Click, click. The thumping got louder. The casket shook on its stand. Roland was kicking, punching, fighting the darkness. "What do we do with him, boss?" Big Sam asked, looking at the shaking box. Do we really bury him? The ground outside is soft. We could dig a hole in 20 minutes. Bumpy looked at the casket. He smoothed his tie. He felt the adrenaline fading, replaced by a deep exhaustion. "No," Bumpy said. "We aren't savages. We don't bury men alive. That's not how we do business." The men looked relieved. Even for them, burying a man alive was a dark road to walk. "Then what?" Junie asked. "Leave him in there," Bumpy said, "for an hour. Let him scream. Let him think about the dark. Let him think about the spit on my face. Let him think about every dollar he took to betray his family. Let him understand what it really feels like to be dead." Bumpy walked over to a pew and sat down. He wiped his face with the handkerchief again, scrubbing the spot where Roland had spat until his skin was red. "Then," Bumpy continued, "we take him out. We put him in a car, and we drop him off at the police station." "The police?" Whispers asked, confused. "Boss, he's a rat. The police will just flip him. He'll testify against us. He'll tell them about the numbers, the shipments, everything." "No, he won't," Bumpy said, looking at the casket. "Because Junie is going to make a phone call to the precinct. He's going to tell them that Roland confessed to the bombing at the restaurant. He's going to tell them that Roland confessed to the sniper shot." "Attempted murder," Junie nodded, catching on. "Exactly," Bumpy said. "But more than that, Roland just admitted he works for the Jewish mob. When we drop him off, we make sure the word hits the street. We make sure the Italians know. The syndicate will know that Roland cracked, that he gave up Goldberg, that he gave up the safe house." Bumpy smiled grimly. "The police are the safest place for him right now. Because the minute he walks out of that station, the Jews are going to think he talked. They're going to think he sold them out to save his own skin. They'll hunt him down," Big Sam realized. "They won't just hunt him," Bumpy said. "They will erase him. He took their money, and he failed to deliver, and now he's a liability. We don't have to kill him, Sam. We just have to let the world know what he is." The casket continued to shake, but the thumping was getting weaker. The air was running out, or the panic was exhausting him. "Let him sit," Bumpy said. "He needs to marinate." Bumpy stood up and walked over to Mamie. She was still standing by the door, watching him. He took her hands. They were cold. "It's over," he whispered. "Is it?" she asked, looking at the casket. "The rat is caught," Bumpy said, "and thanks to him, we know where the enemy lives." He turned to his men. The shock had worn off, and now they stood straighter, looking at Bumpy with a renewed sense of awe. He had cheated death. He had flushed out the traitor. He was unbreakable. "Junie," Bumpy said, "get the car. We have a deli to visit on 4th Street. "Tonight?" Junie asked. "Tonight," Bumpy said. "Goldberg sent a message. It's time I sent a reply." "What about Roland?" Whispers asked, pointing to the box. "Leave Big Sam here to watch him," Bumpy said. "In 60 minutes, dump him on the steps of the 28th precinct. Pin a note to his jacket that says, 'I talked.'" Bumpy walked to the door of the chapel. He pushed it open, stepping out into the Harlem night. The air was cool, fresh. The suffocating heat of the last 2 weeks seemed to have lifted. He was alive. He was free. And he had work to do. As he walked down the steps, he heard the faint, muffled sound of screaming coming from inside the church. It was a terrible sound. But to Bumpy Johnson, it sounded like justice. The drive to 4th Street was silent. Junie drove while Whispers sat in the back with a Thompson submachine gun resting on his knees. Bumpy sat in the passenger seat, watching the city lights blur past. He felt a strange sense of calm. The mystery was solved. The betrayal was over. Now, there was only the reckoning. Goldberg's Deli was a small, unassuming shop on a corner that marked the boundary between territories. It was closed for the night, the metal grates pulled down over the windows. But Bumpy knew better. He knew that the real business happened downstairs, in the basement, where the air smelled of pickle brine and old money. Junie pulled the car up to the curb. "Stay here," Bumpy said to Whispers. "Keep the engine running." "You aren't going in alone, boss?" Whispers asked. "I'm not alone," Bumpy said. "I have Junie, and I have the element of surprise. Remember, as far as Goldberg knows, I'm lying on a slab in a funeral home." Bumpy got out of the car. He adjusted his jacket. He walked to the side door of the deli, the delivery entrance. He tried the handle. It was locked. Junie stepped up and produced a small set of picks. Within seconds, the lock clicked. They slipped inside. The smell of cured meat and sawdust hit them. They moved silently through the dark kitchen, heading for the heavy door that led to the basement. Bumpy could hear voices downstairs. Laughter. The clinking of glasses. He reached the door. He didn't knock. He kicked it open. The door slammed against the wall. Bumpy descended the stairs, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. There were 4 men sitting around a card table in the basement. In the center was a fat man with a cigar, Goldberg. They were drinking champagne. To Bumpy Johnson, Goldberg was saying, raising his glass. "May he rot in." Goldberg stopped mid-toast. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. The other men turned. They saw Bumpy Johnson standing at the bottom of the stairs. He looked like a wraith. His face was still pale from the funeral makeup. His suit was dark as midnight. Goldberg's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "Bumpy?" "Hello, Goldberg," Bumpy said, stepping into the room. Junie stepped in behind him, leveling a pistol at the table. "But you're dead," Goldberg stammered, pushing his chair back. "We heard the heart attack." "Don't believe everything you read in the papers," Bumpy said. He walked over to the table. He picked up the bottle of champagne. He looked at the label. "Expensive," Bumpy noted. "You must be celebrating something special." Goldberg was shaking. The other men were frozen, their hands hovering near their jackets, but none of them dared to move. The myth of Bumpy Johnson was standing in front of them, back from the grave. "Roland sends his regards," Bumpy said. Goldberg went pale. "Roland?" "He's currently occupying my coffin," Bumpy said conversationally. He didn't have much use for it anymore. "He told me everything, Goldberg. He told me about the payments, the bomb, the sniper." Bumpy poured himself a glass of champagne. He took a sip. "It was a good plan," Bumpy admitted. "You almost got me. But almost doesn't count in our line of work." "What do you want, Bumpy?" Goldberg whispered. "You want money? We can pay." "I don't want your money," Bumpy said. He set the glass down. "I want peace." He leaned across the table. "You are going to pack up your operation here. You are going to move back to Brooklyn. And you are never, ever going to cross 110th Street again." "And if we don't?" one of the gunmen asked, trying to sound brave. Bumpy looked at him. "Then I will come back," Bumpy said. "And next time, I won't be the only one rising from the grave. I'll bring an army, and we will burn this deli to the ground, with you inside it." He stood up straight. "You have until morning." Bumpy turned and walked up the stairs, Junie backing out behind him. They left the basement in silence. They left 4 men terrified. Their celebration turned into a wake. Back in the car, Bumpy finally let out a long breath. He leaned his head back against the seat. "Home, Junie," Bumpy said. The car pulled away, heading back uptown, back to Harlem. When Bumpy walked into the penthouse of the Sugar Hill apartment, Mamie was waiting. She had washed her face. She was wearing her nightgown. She looked at him, and then she ran to him. He held her tight. He was tired. His bones ached. But he was alive. "Is it done?" she asked into his chest. "It's done," Bumpy said. He looked out the window at the lights of Harlem, his city, his kingdom. They had tried to kill him. They had tried to bury him. But they had forgotten one thing. You can't bury a king who isn't done ruling. Bumpy Johnson closed the blinds. The night was over. And tomorrow, the sun would rise on a kingdom that knew, without a shadow of a doubt, exactly who sat on the throne. Thanks for listening, folks. If you liked that video and want more, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any Bumpy Johnson stories.